Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 157th of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the first week of March 2025. In today's podcast, latest developments in the geopolitical sphere between Ukraine, the US, and Europe, and what is next for Ukraine. Will actually Europe take the initiative and support Ukraine to the fullest since United States doesn't want to help anymore? So Trump and GD Vance's behavior has been horrible, and it's easy to get desperate, but it's not gonna help Ukraine much. If Trump abandons Ukraine entirely, he will abandon his self-proclaimed role as a peacemaker. His latest outburst was triggered by his interpretation of Zelensky's remarks that Ukraine is not interested in a ceasefire, but simply wants to use American support to continue the fight. The craziness of this situation is that the party least interested in the ceasefire is Russia, as they claim at every opportunity. Russia wants the peace treaty before negotiating a ceasefire. That's why it makes sense for Zelensky to agree to an immediate ceasefire, whatever his misgivings, because it brings the issue back to Putin. So far, we have seen no plan from the United States to end this war. Britain and France have developed several ideas for a coherent process. One danger to be avoided is a two track movement in which the US develops a plan that benefits the Russians and the Europeans a plan that benefits Ukraine. The priority now should be to ensure, where possible, that Ukraine plays an active role in the US led process. Another risk is that proposals that emerged from the US Russian dialogue will remain untested in Ukraine and receive unwarranted support. After all, if Trump really wants to make a deal, he needs Ukraine's consent. Even with serious negotiations and incentive discussions involving all parties, an agreement is likely to be elusive. For now, the Russians are happy that the US is supporting them more than the Europeans, and they will be reluctant to make concessions. As before, what they want is more Ukrainian territory than they have been able to seize and a dormant and disarmed government in Ukraine. Putin may conclude that given that the Ukrainian side is weakened by the loss of American support, he is better off continuing the offensive, patiently explaining to his American intercoolers the fairness of the demands for Ukraine's surrender. Trump has expressed his belief that a deal can and sound be struck quickly. Perhaps Putin will realize that Trump represents the best way out of a disastrous war in which he has achieved none of his stated goals and has put his economy at increasing risks. Perhaps compromises will be reached on the lands that Russia keeps and those that are being vacated. Perhaps a NATO agreement will be reached by all the other measures that Ukraine could take to ensure itself against a future Russian invasion will be taken into account. So far, there has been no hint of concessions from Russia. The main value of properly engaging with the Russians is to find out whether they really have something to offer. If so, then the talks can have their own dynamics. If Trump concludes that there will be no quick wins here, that he talks us tall and without any dynamics, and he has so many other worries, he may well lose interest. In that case, another intervening possibility will arise. Since the spring of 2022, the prevailing opinion in Europe has been that talking to Russia is pointless, and certainly not when Ukraine wants it. It would be unpalatable to view Putin as a serious partner in peace after all he has done, after all the destruction and suffering he has caused. But Trump has broken that taboo. Zelensky and European leaders have recognized that it makes sense to make serious diplomatic efforts even if it means talking directly to the Russians. A precedent has been set. A precedent has been set. This raises the question: if the Americans can talk to the Russians, why can't the Europeans? For now, the United States doesn't want anyone else to intervene, and the Russians are deeply opposed to any European role. But let's assume that the US Russian talks do not lead to anything, either because the Russians are unresponsive to US ideas about a quick ceasefire, or because the US has lost its leverage over Ukraine. The alternative negotiations with a joint Ukrainian European team might yield fewer concessions, but Moscow will have more confidence that the agreements reached will be implemented. Russia has incentive to restore relations with Europe, easing sanctions, regaining lost markets, and reducing dependence on China. In the days leading up to and following the full scale invasion, Putin had several conversations with the Europeans. If we go back to the Minsk agreement in 2014 2015, France and Germany were direct participants. Of course, this story is far from encouraging since it retrospect France and Germany were too passive while Russia was coercing Ukraine and the UK was completely absent. Europe's track record is not impressive at all. In any case, a European led process is unlikely at this stage and should not be considered unless there are clear signals that Moscow is ready to make serious concessions. But it is not unthinkable, and given that so much is happening now that was previously unthinkable, it is still worth considering. So, after the Oval Office conflict, Britain, France, and Germany were trying to limit the damage. Publicly, the administration seems eager to get more difference from Zelensky despite his expressions of gratitude and support for the peace process. They are close to suggestion that resign because he is obstructing peace. Given their history, Ukrainians have a natural aversion to foreign powers choosing their leaders. Any alternatives will not diverge from Zelensky's line. Organizing new elections will take months, even if they can be held at all in wartime conditions. Yes, many of the voters are refugees, displaced persons, combatants, or under occupation. To salvage the process, Zelensky might have to be even more outspoken about his gratitude to the US and his respect for Trump. Agreed to sign the mineral resources agreement immediately, which he was prepared to do on February 28, and insist, contrary to Trump's wishes, that he is more than willing to negotiate a ceasefire or truce, which is currently the preferred term due to the connotations of peace ceasefire for Ukraine as soon as possible. Even if a complete rupture with the US on this issue can be avoided, this is not the same as assuming that things will continue as before. A few weeks ago, US Defense Secretary Pete Hedges asked Britain's Jones Halley to take over as chairman of the Ramstein armed donor group for Ukraine. Hegseth is urgently looking for ways to cut costs in the European theater of operations to support a more focused on the and to focus on Indo-Pacific region. The best guess is that whatever happens in the peace talks, the US presence in Europe will now begin to decline. So, will the Europeans support it? The potential shift in US focus has been apparent for some time, at least since President Obama. Most European governments acknowledge that the Americans are right and that they should bear a greater burden of their own defense, but little has been done to redress the balance. The status quo has always seemed the safer and least costly options. Since the status quo is no longer acceptable, this in itself requires an increase in European defense spending. In addition, the fragmentation and suboptimal state of European defense effort must be addressed. This whole is still much less than the sum of its parts. This is a time of emergency. The challenges that can be praised in stark terms. If Ukraine is allowed to fall, the consequences for Europe will be massive and far more significant than allocating an extra percentage point of its GDP. But the case must be made, and the economic risks of responding to such emergencies must be acknowledged. Zelensky's embrace alone is not enough. With the Russians now spending more than 8% of GDP on their armed forces, and possibly more, European targets are moving from 2% of GDP to 2.5 and sometimes to 3%. President Macron is talking about the need for a higher bar, although he has not yet announced what he intends to do with the French contribution. Germany's next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is still forming his governing coalition and must decide how to secure the necessary fiscal room for maneuver. There is more movement in other countries. The Poles are now thinking about spending 4% of GDP. The Norwegians are committing serious funds. The question of how to use $300 billion worth of seized Russian assets is once again being raised. So what Russia says? Seems like the aggressor is happy with what Trump team has done. Kremlin might be overestimating the benefits of the failed Zelensky-Trump White House meeting for Moscow's narratives. Moscow mouthpieces competed in praising and ridiculing the figures who participated in the February 28th Ukraine-US talks in Washington. To the surprise of many, Ukrainian President Zelensky left the White House empty handed after arriving with the hope of signing a symbolically important mineral resources deal with Donald Trump. Zelensky's words during the meeting, "I'm not here to play cards," echo the same conviction he expressed when he refused to flee Kiev under the threats of Russian tanks, declaring, "I need ammunition, not a trip." Victory in Ukraine's war with Russia remains elusive, and in recent Russian opinion polls, less than a third of respondents expressed a determination to continue fighting. Support for concessions in the name of promising peace deal has barely reached 30%. This does little to motivate Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to show any willingness to compromise. In an interview on March 2nd, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov explained that during Donald Trump's first election, many of our politicians fell into euphoria. Now they are falling into it again. This euphoria can be explained by what Lavrov called the pragmatism and common sense in the US administration's approach to relations with Russia. The Kremlin was likely uneasy about the flurry of diplomatic activity in Washington last week, while its own consultations on normalizing relations and appointing a new ambassador to the US have been slow to move forward. However, the February 28th White House altercation was presented by the Russian state and media as an unprecedented event in the history of international politics and diplomacy and proved that Ukraine has failed. The Kremlin sees the exchange as confirmation that Zelensky is obsessed with the idea of continuing the war and rejecting peace. In Moscow's view, it confirmed that Zelensky is the most dangerous threat to the international community, that he has lost control over reality and is incapable of reaching and adhering to agreements. Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's recently appointed negotiator, called the disagreement historic. Russian state media published a full transcript of the exchange between Zelensky, Trump, and G.D. Vance, which is described as an open exchange. Moscow commentators start to outdo each other in their scathing assessments of Zelensky's political blunders and his poor English. They emphasize official US statements that Zelensky was put in his place and how Zelensky jumped out of the Oval Office after Trump personally ordered Zelensky to leave the White House and the United States. Zelensky's willingness to engage in White House talks reflected his willingness to sign a deal on privileged U.S. access to Ukraine's mineral resources, including rare earth, that was agreed upon despite a host of technical issues and emotional backlash. Moscow has been watching the talks with great concern, speculating that the deal could include deposits in Russian annexed Ukrainian territories. Putin has even tried to counter the deal by offering the United States investment in developing Russia's mineral resources, including aluminum. Russia is rich in a variety of minerals, including rare earths, but many Soviet era discoveries, such as lithium deposits, remain unexplored, and the investment climate is repulsive. The proposals Dmitriev made to his American counterparts were not particularly impressive, but the Ukrainian projects are also far from being profitable. The disappointing cost benefit calculations may have prevented Washington from presenting the agreed document as a great success. Instead of mineral agreement, the key issue has become the demand for a ceasefire. For Ukraine, the central issue is security guarantees, since Zelensky cannot trust Putin's goodwill. For Russia, a ceasefire ignores the root causes of the existential conflict and worries, in Putin words, God's will. Zelensky doesn't deny the problems Ukraine faces in defending itself against Russian invasion, but the same cannot be said for Putin, who continues to pretend that the small successes of Russian troops do not entail huge costs. The depletion of the large battalions of the Russian army can no longer be compensated by the recruitment offers with huge bonuses for volunteers. This in turn will delay any further mobilization effort for many months. While European leaders gathered for an emergency summit with Zelensky in London to discuss the once in a generation moment, Putin's position was assessed here quite differently than in Washington. The summit alarmed many Russia's patriotic commentators. This position of collective strength was not the only manifestation of support for Zelensky by European leaders who gathered for an emergency summit in Paris in parallel with the Russian American talks in Saudi Arabia. These summits reflect a rapidly emerging determination in Europe to invest more resources in building its own defense base and supporting Ukraine in the fight, leaving Russia facing a coalition that outnumbers it in its immediate and most important neighborhood. These events have required tactical rhetorical maneuvering from the Kremlin, as it has spent years building a worldview in which the inherently hostile United States leads a group of docile vassals in confrontation with Russia. This narrative is changing as the Putin Trump rapprochement undermines such simplistic geopolitics. Experts in Moscow have argued that the political discourse needs to be modified, but in reality, the entire political philosophy aimed at breaking US global hegemony needs to change. Putin tried to explain his maneuvers by speaking at the expanded meeting of the Federal Security Service (FSB) board, but the benefits of embracing a sworn enemy were far from obvious to this loyal audience of the most powerful of Russia's intelligence services. To break up transatlantic unity and push the United States out of Europe is a long standing goal of Russian strategy, and a full scale invasion of Ukraine is being used as leverage to achieve this goal. But the Kremlin may be overestimating the value of last Friday's White House meeting to Moscow's narrative. It is convenient to view Europe as disjoint entity with no security agency, but a different reality is emerging faster than Moscow expects. This new Europe has an interest in securing peace in Ukraine, and it is up to European leaders to demonstrate that the real obstacle to a lasting peace is not Zelensky's stubbornness, but Putin's insatiable desire to see Ukraine defeated. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share with your friends.